Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Aaron Sine, founder and CEO of WebRTC Ventures. WebRTC Ventures is a custom design and development agency focused on building live video applications. We're here to help you take your application live. You can learn more about us at webrtc.ventures. Thanks for joining us live today on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitch. Welcome also to any of you watching a replay of today's event. For those of you with us live, you can ask questions throughout the stream by leaving a comment in whichever platform you're viewing this. For today's episode, I'm joined by Robert Strobl, who will be discussing how to implement gold standard privacy and security for video applications. Robert's the CEO and founder at Digital Samba, which allows you to integrate WebRTC video into your application in a GDPR compliant fashion and using end-to-end encryption. Thanks for joining me today, Robert.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for having me on the show. Really good to see you.
Pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's start with a little bit about Digital Samba. Tell us a little bit about the product and how you founded the company.
Yeah, thanks. So Digital Samba is a Spanish video conferencing software company. We were founded in Barcelona in Spain in 2003. So for those viewers old enough to remember, that's the same year as Skype or GoToMeeting. So yeah, we've been around for some time.
Long before WebRTC.
Yeah, long before the iPhone, you know, it's like a
right.
different, feels like the Middle Ages, thinking back to it now. And I guess that's a good segue into the technologies we were using back then. We always believed that browser-based solutions were the way to go. We always wanted to minimize the friction between users and being able to communicate online. So the way for us to do that back then was Flash. And I remember the first time we were able to get people into call in a browser, and my friends, we had like stamp-sized videos and we showed them what we were doing, and they saw us blink and they were super excited about just this amazing frame rate, and today you would laugh at that, but back then that's what the state of the internet was.
Sure. And
we kind of went away and pottered away and built our solution, and suddenly we found ourselves in the market competing with really big companies like WebEx and GoToMeeting. And in order to compete, we figured, okay, we're going to build an API. We're going to make this integratable. We built a REST API. We were one of the first in the industry to do that. And we introduced full white labeling. So we already back then created an application which our customers could easily integrate and build bigger experiences out of. And at the same time, we're building out that full feature set that you would need to compete with the standard virtual classroom and webinar applications out there. But of course, Flash was a challenge. It didn't run on mobile phones. It wasn't very good when it came to responsiveness. It had delays. There were echoes. The video quality was pretty poor. There was a screen share plugin we had to build, which didn't really fit with our mantra of being browser-based. But we had this really cool and animated interface, and people enjoyed using our application. And we were able to stay true to our roots and remain browser-based, while many of our competitors, or all of our competitors, actually built client-side solutions. So you always had to download and update stuff. And when WebRTC came around, we were super excited. Yeah, it was finally, we could complete our vision. We could bring HD video conferencing to the internet. Then we figured out, okay, this technology isn't quite ripe yet. Browsers weren't fully compatible yet. I'm sure you can sing a song or two about this because there's
Absolutely.
still issues. Media servers were still evolving. I'll spare you the details, but we kind of we picked the best frameworks that we had at the time.
Sure.
And we also ended up kind of building a little bit of technical debt in that regard, because we built everything on Angular 1 and CodeIgniter in the back end. And then the pandemic came around and we saw massive growth. Yeah, it was really, really interesting what happened then. I'm very proud that we were able to handle this both on a technology level and also on the company side. And we then used this money that came into our company, because we're completely bootstrapped. So we never had outside investment. We used that to, again, think, okay, it's time to get rid of this technical debt we have gathered. Let's move everything to the most modern frameworks out there. And once again, we found ourselves in a place where we had to redevelop everything, or could redevelop everything, whichever way you think of it. And this gave us the chance to think, where is video conferencing going to go post-pandemic? Yeah, obviously, usage is going to go back down to different levels than during the pandemic, much higher than pre-pandemic, but still, how is it going to be? And we figured, users are going to want fully integrated experiences. You're not going to want to have to switch from one application to another to do day-to-day tasks. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. Different verticals are creating digital experiences. I know that's how you guys make your bread and butter too. Mm-hmm. So this is a super exciting space to be in. It's growing very, very fast, even in these tricky times. And we wanted to lean into our strengths. We've been feature rich. We've got 20 years of experience after all. We have got great customers like Ferrari or McDonald's, just to drop a couple of big names. We've got amazing partners who love Digital Samba, and we want to take them along on this journey into the future. But we also want to be even more developer-centric than we've ever been. And of course, being European, we live in a GDPR-compliant legal landscape.
Yep.
And when we designed this new solution, we designed towards that. So we built something that's completely data agnostic, that has, is built for privacy-minded organizations, and is therefore also privacy framework compatible. Could be GDPR, HIPAA, PIPEDA, whichever it is. That's kind of where we're positioned now. So that's a quick intro of Digital Samba.
Oh, that's great. You summed up 20 years very well there.
Tricky to do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been a little while since we've had someone mention Flash on WebRTC Live. So it's good to remember our roots, even if we don't want to remember all the pain that may have come along with that at times. But yeah, I mean, when we think about the, you mentioned kind of the growth before the pandemic, how things have changed since then, and the sort of vertical integration, as you talked about, the different sort of changes we've seen in the way people build video into their applications. And it's all about that kind of like plateau of productivity, that maturity of the technology and user adoption of it. And one of the things that comes along with building more mature applications for wider spread audiences is having to think more about compliance. Maybe in some startup modes, or when you're focused on only certain regions, you can get away without thinking about it, but that's obviously not a sustainable solution. And so let's start with GDPR compliance, because as you said, you're based in Barcelona. I'm based in the US. Hopefully, regardless of where any of our viewers are based, this is not the first time they've heard of GDPR, because it is definitely important, but especially because you have that perspective of being based in Europe. Tell us a little bit about that regulation. It impacts all internet business in Europe. This is not something exclusive to video communication applications, obviously. But for those who may not be familiar with it, let's just start with a little explanation of what is GDPR.
Yeah, I love how your tone got a bit solemn when talking about GDPR. It's not everybody's favorite topic, so I'll try and get through this quickly. But let's start with a definition. So the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, is a comprehensive data privacy framework introduced by the European Union in 2018, and it's primarily designed to protect the privacy of European citizens. But at the same time, it's definitely highly relevant for US businesses processing EU citizens' data. Very, very recently, we have a very prominent case where Meta, a well-known US organization, was fined 1.2 billion euros for incompliance. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later when we talk about transatlantic data transfers and stuff like that. But there are very clear rules about the size of fines, and you absolutely must comply if you're doing business with European citizens. So if somebody's registering to your platform and the European, you have to worry about this. And again, without going into too much detail, and as you already said, it's kind of like a general guideline or framework for how to deal with users' data. It covers rules around consent, which is why you see checkboxes everywhere on the internet these days, because you're consenting to things. But at least it's trying to surface to people what it is that they're giving their data up for. It also stipulates that you must minimize the data that you collect. So if you don't need it, don't grab it. You must process this data securely. So if you're if people are gonna trust you with their data, you better make sure it's encrypted and stored properly. Your data subjects' rights must be surfaced, so there must be very clear contracts. We have these things called data processing agreements now, and the roles such as data controllers and data processors, where the controllers are typically customers and the processors are typically us, so the providers, are stipulated in these agreements. If there's a breach of data, there are very clear periods of how long you have to notify your users, and you must be transparent about that. There's a new role within organizations called the DPO, or Data Protection Officer, that's also covered by GDPR. So you must have someone in the organization who's thinking about privacy. Data access protocols are a topic. Training of your staff to make sure that they understand what it is they're doing with the data that they're handling on a day-to-day basis. And this has been around for a while, but has been now recreated as part of the EU-US Data Protection Framework on 10th of July, and I think since about 10th of October, the US companies must self-certify according to this new framework, which is fun because previously you had to register under the Privacy Shield framework, and now you can do it all over again as politicians are working these things out. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later as well. Yeah. So overall, I think GDPR requires a mindset shift. It's a way of thinking of how you deal with data. You cannot make personal data your business currency. And it's the opposite. You should really think about which data points you need, touch only those that are absolutely necessary, be transparent in your dealings about how your users' data privacy is processed, make sure that third parties that process data for you are also appropriately vetted. This is a huge topic because none of us do business alone in this day and age. And you must provide clear legal frameworks which users are able to understand. And when you make changes, you must clearly identify what kind of changes you have made. And this essentially, all of this requires constant work and grooming in your organization. I've already mentioned training, but we also do that. We train our staff constantly, and we thereby allow them to make the right decisions in their day-to-day. And I think this is crucial in GDPR.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to cover, but it is a lot of also ultimately like best practices, and so things that you would be training your team on are good practices around privacy anyways. So that's the good side effect of it, even if you're not exclusively working in with European users or based in Europe.
Absolutely. I think it comes from a good place in the end.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when we talk about like video and communication applications in general, what specifically do we need to consider around, say, a WebRTC based architecture when it comes to GDPR?
So there are no specific rules for video applications in GDPR. Like you already mentioned, it's a general data protection framework. And the thing is, though, that audio and video are extremely personal. Let's take an example. You've built a video application for telehealth. Let's say it's psychotherapy. You're running sessions between therapists and patients.
Yep.
It's not going to get much more private than that, right?
Right.
And when you're speaking, when we have interhuman communications without typing, we often get this feeling of comfort, of not being observed. And as we relax more, we also divulge more information. However, we're still talking about some really, really personal stuff here, and this is data that's being transferred down the wire. So right. GDPR requires adequate security measures, and we interpret that in our case that end-to-end encryption should be used for these highly sensitive use cases. So we must provide that as a technology provider. It's again, it's adequacy. It's kind of trying to understand how do you interpret the sensitivity of the data and then provide the right tools for that. Another topic is that video applications are not just about streams anymore. It's also about artificial intelligence and large language models. Right. So again, we're speaking. We don't really know what's happening in the back end right now. Somebody might be transcribing everything we say and storing it. So transcripts, translations, summaries, all of these require large language models. You need to think, are you using a third-party service for this? Are your agreements clearly outlining who's processing this data and with what purpose? And GDPR is very specific about automated processes that happen in the background. So it's very important, this one. I think this one is also a field that's definitely just evolving. clear messaging is important in our world. So when you're going to grab somebody's camera or their microphone and send it down the wire, you need to make sure that you advise the user. You must let them know if they're being recorded. So again, clear messaging. In our case, what we do in our app is that we allow our customers to create their own messaging for their users or link to their own privacy policies, because everybody has their own legal agreements that they want to be able to link to, and we try to make that as easy as possible for them. So that's also, us as a European company, we've built things in that direction because we know of their importance. Yeah, there's a couple of other things I could talk about, but we don't want to go on further.
It's a lot to cover for sure. I mean, I think too about we have dealt more often with HIPAA compliance in the US around healthcare than GDPR, but there's a lot of similar concepts and I think similar impacts in terms of how you might design a WebRTC application, and making sure that you're thinking about things like, if I'm building a WebRTC application, then one of the most problematic areas still would be the signaling, establishing the call, right? So as a developer, if I want to be able to go back and check error logs and see why did Robert and I have some trouble with this conversation, what went wrong with the signaling, right? There may be things that I want to store about that interaction of, IP addresses, where were we, browsers we were using, maybe usernames and other information about our account, all of that. And maybe I'll even be passing some of that around as part of, my custom signaling layer in the application that I build. All of those things, if that were a telehealth, a mental health conversation, like the example you gave, there might be something confidential in there, simply the fact that a person is my patient. If I'm storing that and I'm storing their name as a patient or where they're from or anything like that, those are all things that certainly in HIPAA we need to be very careful with. GDPR, similar concept. So, I think that's where we have to think about kind of the whole scope of our application and what are we storing around it, in including things like our logging, around technical issues and technical protocols. So let's move to security, because you mentioned end-to-end encryption there, and offering end-to-end encryption in Digital Samba is one way to be GDPR compliant, to provide that level of security. What are kind of the security concerns that come up in WebRTC applications in general? How does end-to-end encryption address those?
So first of all, I think it's important to state that security and privacy go hand in hand. You can't protect personal information in an insecure system. So it has to be part of the design of your application. One of the cool things about WebRTC is that it's designed to work only with encryption. The flip side is that it was designed originally for peer-to-peer communication. So when I'm talking to one person on their own, the communication between us doesn't pass through any more parties, and is encoded and decoded. The key handshake basically allows us to pass information only from one to the other. However, once you start to think about scaling and bringing more users into the conversation, you need to start with some kind of a central server technology. In our case, we chose an SFU, or selective forwarding unit, which is great because you can scale, and not so great because it introduces a security risk. Basically, if somebody were to compromise Digital Samba infrastructure, they would be able to eavesdrop and listen in on those conversations that are happening on that server, because you must again decode on the server. And the answer to this is insertable streams. It's a technology that's been around since a couple of years. I think Safari is also caught up eventually, although we actually opened some tickets with them, and I hope that they're going to resolve those issues. So we'll be able to support end-to-end encryption on Safari too very soon. But this allows us to implement E2EE, and it was hard. It's a challenge. It's tricky, to get all of your algorithms right, to make sure that the performance is good. And I think it's also important to consider that it's not just about streams. So, you might be chatting in the application. You might be sharing people's usernames if you have a user list, for example. If you've got a whiteboard, such as the one that we've just introduced, we've yet to add end-to-end encryption to that. So it's a continuous effort to work on security and try and figure out how to solve each of those data types that you're trying to transfer within your application. And I'm quite proud that we're one of the few who have end-to-end encryption for large meetings.
Yeah, no, it is excellent, but it's definitely a layer of complexity, like you said. And I assume as a user of Digital Samba, I can choose whether to enable it or not. And then for things like, the whiteboard that you mentioned where it's not available, that, that's something that, you just factor into those decisions, whether you're using it or not, or, being aware of where it can and cannot be used. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because there are, I think end-to-end encryption is great, and it does give an extra layer of security, which goes hand in hand with privacy, as you said. But there are downsides to implementing it. It's hard or maybe impossible to do for all scenarios. Let's talk a little bit about, and that's because we do, you mentioned SFUs. We have media servers in the middle of most WebRTC conversations these days. Oftentimes we want to do some sort of media processing on that, which is going to make it difficult or impossible to do end-to-end encryption. Let's talk a little bit about what are those downsides of implementing that.
Yeah. So first, right off the gate, if you're handling group calls via some kind of MCU or multi-point control unit, either for video or audio, then you find yourself in a bit of a pickle right there, because you will first need to decrypt the streams before muxing them back together into a single stream. Some providers do that, some do it for video, some do it just for the audio side, because audio and video might have different strategies in some scenarios. So MCUs and E2EE are a problem, or a bit of a no-no. So yeah, thanks for pulling up the slide. I'll talk loosely about some of these points. If you want, you can read along. Basically, yeah, we talked about development. It does significantly complicate the development, or it slows down development. There's additional resources required. It makes the application flow more complicated. On the client side, you must deal with higher resource consumption, the encryption of the streams, and also this constant key exchange that you have to worry about. When users join and leave, you typically generate new keys for the group, and that also requires processing overhead. So this could have negative impacts on performance as such, and it's something that needs to be closely monitored. So it's tricky. And then, like you said, feature reduction. Some services which require client or server-side processing, such as, for example, AI-based transcription services, which require us to access the raw stream data, are not compatible with end-to-end encryption. Same thing with server-side recording. We can't do it. So even though the server might be connecting technically in an end-to-end encrypted way, you cannot call that end-to-end encryption anymore if the provider has access to the decrypted streams. And like you said, you mentioned this at the end of the previous topic, it's all about clear messaging. You have to make sure that your users know as soon as end-to-end encryption is disabled if they turn a certain feature on or off. And Digital Samba tries to, again, make that relatively or as clear as possible for users and make sensible decisions for them. And another one is compliance. End-to-end encryption is a bit of a hot topic because data privacy and government control are not compatible. In some use cases, governments will say we need to have access to the conversation. And in that case, end-to-end encryption is simply not compatible, and you will not be able to use it, not out of a technical reason, but maybe for a legal or compliance purpose. So it's tricky, complicated topic also.
It is definitely, yeah. There's a lot to consider there, so is there, if you want to do something like real-time captioning or transcription, is there any way to do that while also being end-to-end encrypted, or just not possible?
Would love to hear your thoughts on that too. My answer is that currently no, we don't know of a way to do it. The thing is, large language model LLMs are very resource intensive to run. Yeah. It's typically handled on the server. What we would need are lightweight client-side libraries. Right. We're keeping our eye on that because just as we would love to be able to support them in these kind of sessions. You would need to be able to decrypt or just basically encode it or analyze the stream on the client side, send the encrypted version down the wire, and then decrypt it again on the other client.
Yeah.
But I do want to spend 1 minute to talk about how we implemented LLMs, given our GDPR mindset.
Please.
So when we first implemented our proof of concept, we worked with a third-party hosted service. This got us from A to B relatively quickly and allowed us to, build a nice user interface around it and start to get some first feedback from the field. People loved it. But then we recognized that this was not the most data-sensitive approach. We were sending way too much personal information down the wire. And after some discussion, and we all decided that we need to bite the bullet here, take a couple of steps backwards, which is always painful, as you know, went back to the drawing board, had to look for a new provider, somebody who could provide us on-premise solutions. We also made sure that these LLMs are never trained the model with customers' data, which, this is also a tricky topic, has been in the news a couple of months ago. And that was important to us, unless, of course, the customer asks for it. There's some use cases where customers say, look, we've got very specific language in our vertical that we want the model to understand. So then we can talk with them and train specifically for that. But typically, we don't want the model to do that. And this brought with it a whole set of new hosting challenges because of the power consumption of these models. And we want to be able to support summarizations. You mentioned languages. We want to have live translations. We want to have sentiment analysis. And each of these have different hosting strategies associated to them. And I think all of that is a good example of how our privacy-minded approach, which again is kind of fueled by GDPR, influences decisions that you make around your users' privacy.
Yeah. So, and that's a great perspective that, designing for these things up front does influence how you look at things like AI integration and doing on-premise LLMs, et cetera. Yeah, and for our viewers, if you haven't had a chance to see the previous episode of WebRTC Live, which we broadcast from TAD Summit, where I hosted a panel discussion on AI in video and communication applications, Robert and I are touching on a couple of the topics that came up in that discussion as well, and may be interesting. I mean, Robert, you said you'd like to know if I have a solution to the idea of building in AI with a true end-to-end encryption, and unfortunately, I don't either, because as you said, you would have to do something kind of on the client side. But just because there are LLMs like Llama that you can download and run locally, you're not going to run those on the client side. They're not designed for that. The power requirements, the processing requirements are just too intensive. You can look at, there are AI services that you can do an on-premise version of that LLM. And so that way, at least as, which if I understood correctly, Robert, that's what you all have done, is be able to bring that into your private cloud, at least, so that you are able to control and comply with GDPR while still sending information to that LLM and knowing that it's not becoming part of a generic ChatGPT answer to something else, right? Which is really important. And then there's also other services. We had a panelist from Private AI in that panel discussion too, which is a service that will help you take out some of that private information before you send it to an AI as a service type of API. So there's lots of factors to consider, but no easy answer with current compute and power requirements for how you could do that with true end-to-end encryption as well. Let's pause here for a quick ad break. For those of you watching us live, this is a great time to ask any questions that you have just by leaving a comment in whichever platform you're watching this on, Twitch, YouTube, LinkedIn. And after this brief ad break, we will come back and we'll talk more about things like transatlantic transfer data agreement. So we'll be back in just a moment with Robert Strobl from Digital Samba.
Building custom WebRTC video applications is hard, but your go-live doesn't have to be stressful.
We thought we were ready to launch our video application, but we discovered it's a lot harder than we thought. Live video applications are not like building other web or mobile apps. Our team worked hard out there today, but we just didn't have all the right pieces. I'll tell you what we should have done. We should have brought in the live video experts from WebRTC Ventures.
If you're building a live video application, then trust the experts at WebRTC.Ventures to help you design, build, test, deploy, and manage your custom-built application, or integrate live video into your existing application. Contact us today at WebRTC.Ventures.
All right, we're back with Robert Strobl from Digital Samba. As I mentioned right before the ad break, we've talked about end-to-end encryption. We've talked about GDPR some. Either one of those could be an episode in its entirety to deal with all the complexities of it. But another important regulation that's not discussed as much, but is incredibly important for transfer of data between like US companies, EU companies, and users is the Transatlantic Transfer Data Agreement. But it's not discussed as much. So what do our viewers need to know about that, Robert?
A bit of a mouthful, that one. There are basically two main issues here that we should talk about. One of them is what is an international data transfer, and the other one is what does GDPR have to say about it. So the first is relatively obvious. It defines the process of moving and transmitting personal data from one country or jurisdiction to another. And from a privacy standpoint, what this means is that different privacy rules can apply. Of course, once you bring data from the EU into another country, they might have different laws surrounding privacy. So yeah, you can understand that there may be some complexity there. And GDPR is concerned when personally identified information leaves the European Economic Area. And what they have is a list of countries that are considered what they call to have adequacy status. And this is super important because it means that if a country has this adequacy status, then you're allowed to share data freely with it. And the most interesting one here is the relationship between the USA and Europe. We've got a timeline here to show what's been happening over the years, so thanks for bringing that up. But just to underline the importance, approximately $7.1 trillion per year of EU-US economic relationships are bound to these data transfers between our two continents and economic powers. So if we just go through this timeline together really quick, you'll see that this has been going on since about 2000, since the year 2000. So that's 23 years now. The first decision was made in 2000, where the Safe Harbor Framework decision granted the US adequacy. And then a few things happened. So there is a data protector lawyer in Austria, in Europe, called Max Schrems, and he has been essentially battling Facebook for some time. And always doing this these are multi-year cases that have been going on and always involved multiple instances of data protection commissions and the European Court of Justice. They took a lot of resilience, but eventually, and this is popularly referred to as the Schrems 1 decision, this adequacy status was revoked in 2015. This was, I believe this one was all around also some of the uncoverings of Snowden and mass surveillance by the CIA of European and worldwide citizens. So this is complete, a complete counter to what Europeans consider how their data should be, is kind of holy and should not be touched, versus the CIA, which thinks, hey, we should be able to control everybody. And then in 2016, some new regulations, some new laws were formed, and this privacy shield was agreed upon, which again gave the US adequacy. Kind of the same thing happened, and in 2020 it was revoked once again. And now again, they've come up with this Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework, which once again grants the US adequacy. But what's next? We know that it's already being challenged by a French member of Parliament, of European Parliament. So it's already going to go to the European Court of Justice. Max Schrems has also already announced that he's going to appeal, because essentially what they're saying is that not a lot has changed. The thing that has changed is that President Biden has issued an executive order. But an executive order is, at least to my understanding, not exactly a law. So once the new if an administration change should come about in the US, there's a good chance that this executive order is going to be revoked, which is going to bring the previous legal position into play again, which is then going to devalidate this data transfer agreement.
And yeah, we don't like feeling inadequate in the U.S. We have a fragile ego, but yeah, no, you're absolutely correct about executive orders. They are essentially temporary.
A lot of money, and there's a very, very strong economic interest for both of our continents to do business with one another. And absolutely. I guess the question is really, what does it mean? If it's going to get devalidated again, what kind of impact does that have? And one thing we know is that the Meta case has already made it very clear that these standard contractual clauses and other measures that you're supposed to put into place cannot be relied upon with certainty. Meta obviously tried to do it, but still got fined. And overall, I think we can be summarized to say that this is a very uncertain political landscape. So if you are if European data and data transfer is important to you, then you have to make decisions based on, that should be future-proof as far as that is possible. And there is no really great answer to this. Yeah, if you're European, maybe work with European. It's a bigger topic.
Yeah, it's complicated, and thankfully, neither of us are politicians or lawyers.
Yes.
So but as technical leaders, as architects, we still have to build things as future-proof as we can, as you said. Is there anything specific around this that we should be sort of accounting for in our architectures, or if we're thinking about things like GDPR and cloud hosting zones based in the EU,
right?
Those
and
types of things.
It's also the CTOs and CIOs and DPOs of various organizations. They're in charge of their users' data, and they need to make these decisions. They need to understand what kind of risks they're putting their users and, of course, their organizations under moving forward. Yeah. There's only so much we can do. Like you said, we're not politicians. We can only work within the frameworks that we're given.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned earlier that it was not easy to implement things like GDPR and end-to-end encryption within Digital Samba as a product. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more. If someone, for example, is building a WebRTC-based solution today, and maybe they're not initially expecting to do business in Europe, should they still sort of build it with GDPR in mind from the start? How, given your experience in building it to be compliant with that, how hard was that? How necessary is it to do that from the start?
Yeah, it very much depends on your audience. So, and what your mindset is towards privacy and security. And maybe also if you're using peer-to-peer or secure or server-side technology, there's a bunch of considerations there. I guess that's also your use case. If it's smaller calls, you can rely on peer-to-peer, which makes things a lot easier. If not, you're going to use some server-side stuff. But if at some point you're planning to accept European citizens to sign up to your service, or if you're planning to handle sensitive data, and if it might not be GDPR, it could be HIPAA or PIPEDA. Yeah, it could be one of those agreements, one of those frameworks too, or TICSEA or whichever. Like the automotive industry, for example, has their own guidelines that you need if you want to do business with them. So yes, then I highly recommend you take the time to analyze this. It's better to start on the right foot than on the wrong one, because trying to fix it later is difficult. And this is a bit of a shameless plug here, but this might lead you to the decision to not want to build everything yourself and rather work with a provider who can do these kind of things for you. And you ask, how hard is this? So it's a culture thing that you have to build within your organization.
Yes.
We have to make on our side tough decisions every day. A good example is less data collection, or not using certain US providers to collect data, such as Google Analytics, was a really tough decision for us. So it's harder for us to track what's going on from the marketing side within our application. So we've made a choice to not have analytics anywhere within our app itself. So it's tough. It isn't easy.
Yeah, no, they're tough choices. And you mentioned HIPAA and PIPEDA in Canada, and so I know you've got a great comparison here between those. Let's take a look at that and talk a little bit about how much overlap is there between these regulations. And, for someone like us who has built HIPAA compliant applications before, how much overlap that helps us if we then realize it also needs to be GDPR compliant.
Yeah, and just a quick caveat here, I'm obviously not an expert on all of these frameworks, but we can try and cover some of this superficially. And
Right.
I also, Anna wants me to mention our marketing, head of marketing, that we've got a blog post coming up about this in a couple of days. So if you want, you can follow us on LinkedIn or whatever your poison is. You can follow us, and we'll deliver that straight to your inbox. But at their core, these three regulations share a common purpose, which is the protection of personal information and preservation of privacy. And GDPR is obviously European. To some, they consider this to be the gold standard of data protection. It applies not only to entities within the European Union, but pretty much anybody who works with European citizens' data. HIPAA, on the other hand, is US specific. It safeguards protected health information and typically affects companies working in healthcare, so healthcare providers, insurance companies, and their business associates. And PIPEDA, which is Canadian, is again more similar to the GDPR in that it covers a broad spectrum of personal information in the commercial sphere, but it has a unique focus on consent and consumer rights. All three of them demand robust measures to protect data from unauthorized sources. They all require organizations to notify of breaches within strict timelines. And importantly, they grant individuals rights over their personal information. And yes, there are definitely differences between each of these. So being compliant with one does not immediately make you compliant with the other. You have different legal frameworks that you need to build between yourselves, your customers, your users, data controllers and data processors. And yeah, so, you mentioned this earlier. Yeah, if the more data agnostic you can be in the design of your application, the easier it's going to make it for you to comply with these frameworks later on when the time comes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a couple of interesting things about complying with these regulations too is, like HIPAA in the US was, I think it was 1995 that law was originally passed, definitely before the modern internet for sure. And so it doesn't really speak to what you do with a telehealth type of situation directly, because that didn't really exist. No one knew that was a thing, at that time, right? It is talking about general protection of identifying information around patients, how to handle that. And a lot of it deals with, as you also mentioned with GDPR, of notifications when breaches occurs and how you do that. So a lot of it is also completely non-technical in nature, process oriented, and so you really need to have a privacy officer in your organization who can take the time to understand those different regulations that you're complying with, how to handle breach notifications, obviously how to prevent them, but if they do happen, how you handle notification around that. And this applies to people beyond, say, just the telehealth provider, right? So with HIPAA, they talk about covered entities. And if you're a covered entity, then you definitely have to sign a business associate agreement. And, a covered entity might be someone like Digital Samba, if that's integrated into your telehealth application. It might be someone like us at WebRTC Ventures if we're dealing with patient information. And so it's not just the core organization. It's thinking about those other tools, services, companies, subcontractors that you integrate with. All of those also have to be, mindful and compliant with these sorts of things. So, yeah, it's complicated. It's a little bit of an eye chart here, right? To just try and see the differences between just these three. But if you actually try to print out and look at the full stack of regulations, I've paid good money to telehealth specific lawyers before so that I didn't have to read it. It's not an easy thing to understand for sure, but important to do because obviously privacy is important in a lot of scenarios. So that's great too that you mentioned you'll have a blog post talking more about this coming up, and we'll link to that as well in the show notes from this And in fact, looks like we have a different Anna from your team. That is the link right there. So
awesome, cool. Thanks, Anna.
All right. Now let's kind of shift away a little bit from the security and privacy conversation in our final few minutes here. I'd love to hear a little more about Digital Samba. I know you have a pre-built WebRTC option, an important part of your offerings. Can you talk a little bit about the trade-offs between pre-built and more custom-built solutions and what that offering from Digital Samba provides?
Yeah, finally we can talk about tech. So, yeah, I mean, it's
take off your lawyer hat.
The trade-off is simple. It's basically ease and speed of implementation versus flexibility. So, Digital Samba offers something that's called pre-built or low code or embedded, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of all the same thing. What it does, it saves you time and money. It gets you to market faster, but you definitely give up a lot of control. So kind of you need to figure out what makes sense for you. What we believe in and what our vision is that most verticals want to have a subset of those features that they've already learned to use during the pandemic. They've used them day to day. That's what they know and love. But they now want to have them integrated into all these particular vertical experience. We talked about telehealth before, but learning is one. We don't need to list them all. And the reality is nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to have to develop, everybody has to have device selection for cameras, remote muting, reconnection procedures, bandwidth management. The list goes on and on and on. Why would you want to build all of that yourself? What we want to do is we want to give developers a positive experience in the form of a fully integrated video conferencing of day zero of signing up with us. That's super important that we can get developers to feel like they've achieved something that they can show to the management as quickly as possible. We've completely abstracted away all the complexity of building a video conferencing application, but we've also used this 20-year experience that we have in APIs and white labeling to allow developers to make this their own and create a really seamless experience that tailor to their use case. It could be a one-on-one telemedical consultation or a large virtual classroom. You'll get there at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time. And you have to think it's not just about your go-to-market time, but this continued maintenance. The browser landscape is continuously changing. Technologies are evolving. AI is being introduced. We don't know where the journey is going to go really, but if you've got a partner like Digital Samba who takes care of all of this for you, you've kind of bought into that platform, that roadmap, and you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. You can just check it on and off. And of course, you'll still need a small development team on your side, to keep that integration going, but you definitely don't need a dedicated team towards video. And you don't have to worry less about privacy also as a bonus.
Right, exactly. Some of this will be handled for you, though obviously you still always have to consider the scope of it in your full application as well.
Sure.
And I think particularly in the early stages of an application, these are really attractive options to have and lets you focus on things beyond the video, because there is a certain amount of aspects of video development, like turning cameras on and off, like you said, that should be kind of table stakes at this point. And so being able to focus on how do we really properly integrate this into a unique business flow and make sure that the integration of that video, that communications into this application is really delivering some value from having it all vertically integrated. That's what's really fun about this, more than handling muting and unmuting, right? Even, for us as experts who have done this in many, many situations, and, for anyone building around these sorts of APIs. So now, speaking of fun features, there's one last thing I want to highlight from you all that I think is interesting. The grid layout feature, where I've got a screenshot here from you that I'll bring up. I believe you list 100 broadcasters at once, right? And 49 tiles per page. That sounds like a pretty brutal group meeting, but technically very interesting. Tell a little bit more about that feature, sort of the use cases and the challenges that you're solving around that.
Yeah. So, I talked in the beginning about how we went back to the drawing board when we built this latest and greatest version of Digital Samba. And at that time, or before Zoom, nobody was talking about these huge amount of broadcasters. Nobody could do it technically. Everybody said that this is nonsense. Nobody wants to do it. And then suddenly Zoom pushed that out, and suddenly everybody wanted it. I was like, I can't live without having 100, broad and 49 people per page. So we thought, okay, we don't want to be with our back to the wall in any kind of sales conversation. Let's spend a lot of time. Let's get this right. And we really, we didn't want to move past that initial milestone, adding any more features until we got the basics right. In the end, what we're building is a video conferencing application, and we want to be up there at the top. And when people, integrate us, they should also be able to enjoy that easily. So yeah, we did it. We use cook with water like everybody else in the end of the day. So we use simulcast technologies and layers in order to be able to transmit video and pipe the right level of CPU usage and bandwidth to those users that need it. We kind of make some intelligent decisions in the background as more and more users start to get added to the grid. We kind of handle different layouts, different modes in the application. So we make some decisions there for the users, which we consider to be sensible. We implement paging, which basically means you're always only subscribing to those users who are currently visible on the screen. We also have pinning and full screening, which again, as a particular user wants to see one user's information, then we're able to push higher video quality to that particular person. So and we also, what we make sure is that the people who are speaking, when you're looking at a grid, the people who are speaking are the ones that get the highest bandwidth, because that's a natural experience. Who are you looking at? The ones that are actively participating in the conversation, and that all of that together works pretty well. There are some individual strategies for audio. So obviously, you don't need to subscribe to everybody's audio stream if they haven't been speaking. Comes with a bit of a caveat. Sometimes it's there's on a technical side, it could be that somebody hasn't spoken for a while. It takes a little bit of time until their audio connects. So there's some trade-offs, but overall, that's kind of what we've done. And I'm sure you can appreciate, it took a lot of engineering, both client and server side, and infrastructure considerations. And
yeah, no doubt. And there's
thanks for recognizing that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this sort of thing is always interesting because it does, how you would implement a feature like this can vary a lot, I believe, architecturally, and those trade-offs that you were talking about that you make and streams you subscribe to can vary a lot with the type of use case you're doing, right? If the purpose of putting 49 people on the screen at once is that you're going to have 10 screens like that behind a band doing a virtual concert, and you just want to see people dancing to the band, that's one implementation, right? And that's an implementation when you don't need to hear their audio. Nobody wants to hear them singing with the band, just seeing them dancing with the band, right? Very different scenario than if this is a maybe a corporate earnings call where you do want to have 49 journalists on the screen being able to interact by audio. Maybe not in that use case, right? But there's all different sorts of ways you might look at the implementation of this based on the use case. So I think that's always interesting to consider. Well, we are out of time, Robert, but this has been a really wonderful conversation. Really appreciate it. I'm going to put a little information up here for how people can get in touch with you and learn more about Digital Samba. Do you have any last parting bits of advice that you want to share, or anything you want to point our viewers to?
If you guys want to reach out, please reach out to me anytime. I really appreciate, having been on this show. Really nice to connect with you again, and I look forward to seeing you around.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Thanks so much, Robert. Really appreciate it. Pleasure having you here. So yeah, as always, this video will be posted on our YouTube channel for WebRTC Ventures, as well as on our blog. So you'll be able to watch replay and share it from there as well. Our next episode will be December 6th with Ryan Jesperson from Dolby talking about live streaming with WebRTC. To find out more about our upcoming episodes, follow us on social media at WebRTC Ventures, on Twitch, LinkedIn, YouTube. Join our email list at webrtc.ventures. So thanks again to Robert for joining us today. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Let's make it live.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at webrtc.ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.